Derek Zoolander became one of the most famous fictional male models in the world. Commander Shepard became a face millions of gamers trusted through battles, choices, losses, and impossible endings. Somehow, both lead back to the same Dutch model. Mark Vanderloo was already a major name in fashion before most people ever heard Zoolander or played Mass Effect.
Excuse me, brah. You're excused. And I'm not your bra.
He had the Hugo Boss campaigns, the Calvin Klein work, the magazine covers, the runway years, and the kind of career very few male models managed to keep. Yet two borrowed versions of him traveled farther than his own name. One became a punchline. One became a hero. And before any of it happened, Vanderloo was just a history student in Amsterdam who had no serious plan to become a model.
The cube. How do you feel about that? Are most of the guys you work with dumb?
Mark Vanderloo began life with a quieter name, Marcus Vanderloo. He was born on April 24, 1968, in Waddinxveen, a Dutch town far from the fashion capitals that would later put his face on billboards, magazine covers, and campaign walls. His childhood started far outside that world. When he was 3, his family moved to Kenya, and he spent much of his early life there before returning to the Netherlands. It was an unusual start for someone who would later become one of Europe's most recognizable male models, though nothing about it looked designed for fashion at the time. He was a Dutch boy growing up partly in East Africa, then coming home to build a life that pointed in a much more ordinary direction. There were no runway lights waiting in the background. There was no public image being shaped yet. His early life stayed simple, private, and far removed from the industry that would eventually study his face from every angle. The man people would later recognize from Hugo Boss, Calvin Klein, Donna Karan, and Armani came from a place that had almost nothing to do with studios or campaigns. Kenya gave his childhood distance from Europe. Waddinxveen gave it a small-town beginning. Amsterdam would later become the place where his life turned, though even that turn began quietly. Before modeling entered the picture, Vanderloo was still moving through a life that looked steady and unplanned. By his early 20s, he had no clear reason to think of himself as an image. He was a student, studying history at the University of Amsterdam, spending his days with a subject built on patience, reading, and memory. It was a very different world from the one waiting for him. Fashion would eventually take the most recognizable thing about him, his face, and send it into places he could never have planned. Before Hollywood turned part of his name into Derek Zoolander, and before video games shaped his features into Commander Shepard, Vanderloo was still a Dutch student whose life had already crossed continents without becoming public. The Kenya years did not predict the modeling career. They simply made the beginning less predictable. He returned to the Netherlands, studied history, and lived outside the world that would later make him famous. Then one camera noticed him, and a private face began moving into public life. When Vanderloo returned to the Netherlands, his life still looked ordinary. At 22, he went to the University of Amsterdam to study history. It was a quiet path, built around books, lectures, and long hours with the past. Modeling belonged to another world entirely. One built around instinct, presence, and the ability to communicate before speaking. That difference made his discovery feel less planned. Many models enter the industry already moving toward it, with portfolios, test shoots, agency meetings, and a clear hunger for that kind of work. Vanderloo had chosen something else. His days were shaped by study, not castings. By the time fashion found him, he already had a direction. He was old enough to imagine a future that had nothing to do with runways or campaigns. That made modeling feel less like a childhood dream coming true, and more like a life being interrupted. The work moved fast once it started, but the beginning never lost that accidental quality. That is what makes the scale of what followed sharper. He had a campus, a subject, and a life that made sense without cameras. Then a routine day connected to someone else's photo shoot changed everything in front of him. In 1990, Vanderloo went with his girlfriend to a photo shoot in Amsterdam. She was the one modeling that day. He was there because of her, standing near the edge of a job that had nothing to do with him yet. Then the photographer noticed them together and used them in a milk advertisement. What started as someone else's shoot became the first time his own image entered fashion. That moment did not immediately turn him into someone chasing a modeling career. Vanderloo was still a history student, and modeling was far from the life he had been building. The attention came before the ambition. People in the industry saw something in him before he had any real reason to think of himself that way. The beginning worked because it felt so unplanned. He had not arrived with a portfolio or a clear plan to be noticed. He came as a boyfriend, not as the main subject. The camera changed that. One ordinary commercial job gave him a first look at what other people could see when they looked at him. The milk advertisement itself was small compared with everything that came later. It was not a luxury campaign, a major magazine cover, or a runway booking that announced him to the world. It was a simple commercial, the kind of job most people would never connect to a future supermodel. But it placed him in front of a camera, and the result was enough to open the next door. That first shoot also showed something that would follow him for years. Vanderloo could stay quiet while the image did the moving. His face could be booked, styled, printed, and recognized, even when the man behind it remained less public than the work. He did not need to become a loud personality for the industry to keep using him. The camera had already found what it needed. That is why the Amsterdam photoshoot became more than a lucky break. One day, he was standing beside his girlfriend's work. Soon after, agencies and brands began seeing him as someone who could carry their own ideas. The career began with a small advertisement, a photographer's eye, and a face that suddenly had somewhere else to go. After that first shoot, Vanderloo's life still moved close to normal. Around 1992, he was earning extra money as a bartender in Holland while taking small modeling jobs near his village. The work was still local, and the money behind the bar was easier to understand than the strange attention coming from cameras. A few $100s a night, a part-time job here and there, and a life that still looked more practical than glamorous. Then, Wilhelmina Models stepped in. Once Vanderloo signed with the agency, the pace around him changed quickly. He was no longer just the Dutch student who had photographed well in a small advertisement. He was being moved toward the international circuit, where agencies, casting teams, designers, and photographers decided which faces would define a season. The work became bigger, faster, and harder to ignore. By 1994, he had moved to New York and was working as the model for Calvin Klein's Obsession. The city pushed him into a completely different rhythm. New York was where fashion, advertising, magazines, and celebrity crossed paths every day, and Vanderloo's face fit easily into that world. What had started near home was now being shaped by one of the biggest names in American fashion. The following year, Hugo Boss made him the face and body of its couture and ready-to-wear lines. That booking gave him a different kind of presence. Calvin Klein used him in a more intimate, charged way, while Hugo Boss placed him inside sharp tailoring and clean European control. Vanderloo could carry both sides without looking forced. He had the rare kind of face that could shift with the brand and still remain recognizable. That flexibility became one of his strongest advantages. Some models become tied to one look so tightly that every job feels like a repeat of the last. Vanderloo avoided that trap. He could look polished, serious, relaxed, or distant, depending on what the campaign needed. For a male model, that kind of range was especially valuable because the space for male supermodels was smaller and harder to hold. By the mid-1990s, the industry had clearly taken him seriously. His name was appearing beside major brands, and his face was becoming familiar to the people who built campaigns and booked runways. The attention around him was still different from the attention given to actors or pop stars. It lived more inside fashion magazines, casting rooms, fragrance ads, and menswear campaigns. That made the fame narrower, but inside the business it carried real weight. Later recognition would confirm the place he had already earned. Models.com placed him among its legends and icons, and Vogue included him in its list of the top male models of all time. Those honors came after years of work, but the foundation was already there in the 1990s. Vanderloo had moved from bartending and local modeling into the center of fashion, and he had done it with a face that brands kept finding new ways to use. By the middle of the decade, Vanderloo was no longer being carried by one lucky break. His face had started to move through different corners of fashion, and each brand used him in a slightly different way. Hugo Boss put him in sharp suits and clean lines. Calvin Klein leaned into a closer, more intimate image. Donna Karan and DKNY placed him in a modern city world, polished enough for fashion but relaxed enough to feel lived in. That range helped him stay visible. He was not the kind of celebrity people followed for interviews, scandals, or public drama. His work moved through images. Someone could see him on a billboard, in a magazine, or in a fragrance campaign and remember the face before knowing the name. For a male model in the 1990s, that kind of recognition already meant he had reached a rare level. The era made women like Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford, Linda Evangelista, and Claudia Schiffer famous far beyond fashion. Male models lived in a different space. Even when they were working at the highest level, their names often stayed closer to editors, casting directors, designers, and photographers. Vanderloo belonged near the top of that world. He had the bookings, the visibility, and the kind of image the industry kept returning to, even if the wider public did not follow him the way it followed movie stars. His resume from that period shows how widely he was used. Along with Hugo Boss and Calvin Klein, he worked with names like Valentino, Armani, Gucci, Hermes, Banana Republic, Donna Karan, Trussardi, and Guess. Those brands were not all selling the same version of a man. Some needed elegance. Some needed ease. Some needed a sharper, more controlled look. Vanderloo could move between those moods without losing what made him recognizable. That is one reason his career did not flatten into one repeated image. He could stand in a tailored campaign and look completely at home, then appear in a more relaxed fashion story without seeming out of place. He had enough presence to be remembered, but he did not overpower the clothes, the fragrance, or the world around him. In modeling, that balance can be the difference between a brief moment and a career that keeps expanding. By 1995, fashion had made him one of the most visible male models of his generation. His name meant something inside the industry. Editors knew him, brands booked him, photographers understood what they could get from him. The fame was not the same as Hollywood fame, but it was real. It lived in campaign pages, runway lineups, magazine covers, and the memory of people who paid attention to menswear. To the public, that kind of fame can look strange. A person might know the face from an ad and still have no name for it. Inside fashion, there was no confusion. Vanderloo had become one of the men who helped define the look of the decade. That gap between a familiar face and a less familiar name would later become part of his story. Before comedy and video games borrowed from him, fashion had already made him recognizable enough to be used in ways that reached far beyond the runway. In 1996, Vanderloo became one of the first men to appear on the cover of Marie Claire. For a male model, that placement carried real weight. Marie Claire was built around women's fashion, beauty, and celebrity, so putting him on the cover showed how far his image had traveled. He was no longer limited to menswear campaigns or fragrance ads. His face could hold space in a magazine world that usually gave that kind of attention to women. Around the same period, his runway schedule reached a level few models could maintain. At one point in the 1990s, he was doing 50 shows during Fashion Week. That kind of number sounds glamorous from the outside, but the work itself was exhausting. It meant fittings, castings, waiting rooms, hair, makeup, quick changes, late nights, early calls, and another runway before the last one had even settled. That pace says more about his career than a single campaign ever could. A model can book one famous ad and still disappear after a season. Vanderloo kept being chosen. Show after show, brand after brand, under the kind of pressure where another face was always available. The finished photos made everything look effortless, but the job required stamina, timing, patience, and the ability to deliver the same level of control again and again. The Marie Claire cover and the heavy runway work placed him in a category the fashion world understood immediately. He had become valuable across print, runway, fragrance, tailoring, and editorial work. Some models were tied to one market or one style. Vanderloo moved through several parts of the industry at once, and that made him harder to replace. In 1995, VH1's Fashion and Music Awards named him Male Model of the Year, which showed how visible he had become by that point. The award fit the moment. He had the campaigns, the runway volume, the magazine presence, and the kind of polished international image that fashion kept using. It was the stage of his career where his name meant something inside the industry, even while his face often traveled further than the name attached to it. By then, fashion had already turned Vanderloo into a reference point. He looked serious, controlled, and expensive without needing to explain himself. That quality made him useful in campaigns, on runways, and across magazine pages. Soon, the same recognition that made him valuable in fashion would start reaching other places, including comedy and video games. The first time Vanderloo's fashion status reached a much wider audience, it came through comedy. Derek Zoolander began at the 1996 VH1 Fashion Awards, where Ben Stiller appeared as a clueless male model in a short film written by Drake Sather. The character was built as a joke about the fashion world, the poses, the seriousness, the strange bubble of fame around people whose job was to look good in clothes. A few years later, that short sketch became the 2001 movie Zoolander, and the joke grew far beyond the industry it was mocking. The name came from real fashion circles. When the filmmakers were shaping the character, fashion stills producer Gabe Doppelt brought up Mark Vanderloo as an example of a famous male model. His name had the exact sound they needed. Believable enough for fashion, unusual enough for comedy. They blended it with another model name, Johnny Zander, and Derek Zoolander was born. Vanderloo did not have to appear in the movie for his presence to be felt. The name carried the kind of fashion world weight the character needed. It sounded like someone who could exist on a runway, stare into a camera, and be taken seriously by people inside that world. Then the movie twisted that seriousness into something ridiculous. Derek became vain, confused, dramatic, and convinced of his own depth, which made the fashion reference even sharper. The funny part is how far the character traveled after that. People who had never followed modeling still knew Zoolander. They knew Blue Steel. They knew the tiny phone, the runway walk-off, the absurd confidence, and the idea of a male model taking himself far too seriously. For many viewers, Zoolander became their clearest image of male modeling, even if the real names behind the joke meant nothing to them. That left Vanderloo in a rare position. His name helped shape one of the most famous fictional male models ever created, while he stayed outside the noise of the character. Fashion people could hear the connection. Most viewers only heard the joke. Zoolander came out in 2001 and built a longer life through television quotes, fashion references, and the internet. Over time, Derek Zoolander started to feel completely invented. The real model behind part of the name faded into the background while the parody became louder. Vanderloo had not chased Hollywood through the role. His name entered pop culture because fashion had already made it useful. The second time Vanderloo's image moved far beyond fashion, it happened through video games. In Mass Effect, BioWare gave players the chance to customize Commander Shepard, the central figure of its science fiction trilogy. Players could change Shepard's appearance, background, and personality through the choices they made. But the default male version had one clear face, and that face came from Mark Vanderloo. Mark Meer provided the voice, while Vanderloo's features gave the character his most familiar look. That default version became the Shepard many people recognized first. He appeared on covers, in trailers, in screenshots, and across promotional images for the series. Even players who changed their own Shepard still saw that version attached to the franchise. The cropped hair, steady stare, armored body, and soldier's expression became part of the way Mass Effect presented its hero to the world. This was a very different kind of connection from Zoolander. The comedy used the sound of Vanderloo's name and turned it into a joke about male modeling. Mass Effect used his face more directly. The result reached an audience that may have known nothing about Hugo Boss campaigns, Calvin Klein ads, or 1990s fashion. Gamers saw the character first. The model behind the face could remain completely unknown to them. Commander Shepard also became more than a promotional image. Across 3 main games, players spent hours making decisions through him, building friendships, choosing romances, losing crewmates, and carrying the story through war, sacrifice, and survival. The character belonged to BioWare, and Mark Meer gave the male version his voice. But the face many players returned to came from Vanderloo. That makes the Mass Effect connection one of the stranger turns in his career. Fashion had already trained his image to say something without speech. A campaign photo only has a moment to work, and Vanderloo had spent years giving brands that kind of silent presence. In Mass Effect, that same quality moved into a different form. His face became part of a character players could guide, protect, question, and remember. Vanderloo's role in the game was visual, and that is enough for this story. He was not the actor behind Shepard's voice or the writer behind Shepard's choices. Still, one of gaming's most recognizable heroes carried his features. The face that once sold suits, fragrances, and fashion campaigns became the face of a commander in a space opera. The Mass Effect connection follows the pattern that had already shaped Vanderloo's career. In fashion, he was recognizable to the people who booked campaigns and studied magazine pages. In Zoolander, part of his name reached comedy. In Mass Effect, his face became familiar to players who may never have known the model behind it. Each version moved differently, but all of them came from the same source. Decades after his first break, the bookings were still coming from major names. In 2023, he appeared in a Versace men's campaign photographed by Mirt Alas and Marcus Pigott. In 2025, he was still appearing in Brunello Cucinelli advertising, along with runway work for Dunhill and Giorgio Armani. A Gantt campaign followed in 2026. Those credits do not feel like a one-season comeback. They show a model still being used by serious brands long after the decade that first made him famous. That kind of longevity is rare in any part of fashion, and it carries extra weight for male models. The industry has always given men less public space than the women of the supermodel era. A male model can work at the highest level and still remain half-known to the wider public. Vanderloo's run pushes against that pattern. He had the 1990s peak, the major campaigns, the runway volume, and then the later work that kept adding years to the career. Other famous male models became tied to clearer public lanes. Tyson Beckford became closely linked with Ralph Lauren and crossed into broader celebrity. David Gandy became one of the faces people connected with Dolce & Gabbana Light Blue. Sean O'Pry belonged to a later period shaped by rankings, earnings lists, and digital visibility. Lucky Blue Smith came from a generation where social media could turn a model into a public personality almost overnight. Vanderloo moved through fashion without relying on scandal, constant interviews, or one fixed public persona. Brands kept returning to him because the image still worked. As he aged, the face changed, but it kept the controlled presence that made it valuable in the first place. Fashion can honor its past for one season and move on quickly. Repeated work across years is different. Vanderloo's later credits show more than affection for a 1990s name. Designers and brands could still place him in a current campaign or runway and have it make sense. A 2018 Dior home show made that point clearly when it brought him back alongside other prominent men from the 1990s. It reminded people that male fashion had its own supermodel history, even if that history was often less public than the women's side of the era. Vanderloo did not look like someone being brought out only for memory's sake. He still fit the room. That is the strongest part of his standing. A model can be everywhere for a few seasons and disappear as soon as the industry wants a new face. Vanderloo avoided that shorter path. From the early 1990s into the 2020s, the work kept finding him again. In a profession built around replacement, that kind of return says more than any single campaign could. Mark Vanderloo's career became hard to categorize because so much of it lived beyond his own name. Part of it reached people through Derek Zoolander, a comedy character shaped by fashion references. Another part reached players through Commander Shepard, the face many people guided through Mass Effect's biggest choices. Around those borrowed images was the real model, still moving through campaigns, covers, runway shows, and late career bookings long after his first rise. Fame usually works in a cleaner way. A person becomes known for a name, a role, a scandal, a quote, or one image the public can hold on to. Vanderloo's fame moved differently. His face traveled further than his biography, while his work kept pulling him back into fashion. That is why his place among the greatest male models does not need to be built on public spectacle. The record is already there. He went from an accidental milk advertisement in Amsterdam to Calvin Klein, Hugo Boss, Marie Claire, V. H1 recognition and years of major fashion work. He became connected to Zoolander and Mass Effect without turning himself into a loud public figure. Then he kept working long after the decade that first made him famous had moved on. Most modeling careers burn bright for a short time. Male modeling careers can be even harder to stretch, especially at the level where the public remembers anything clearly. Vanderloo's career crossed decades. It moved from Amsterdam to New York, from Fashion Week to Hollywood comedy, from luxury advertising to video games, then back into fashion again. The borrowed versions may be easier for some people to recognize. The real career remains stronger. Mark Vanderloo left one of the clearest records a male model can leave. People kept choosing the face. They chose it for suits, fragrances, magazines, runways, parody, gaming, and late career campaigns. Even when the name moved into other forms, the work kept coming back to him.